Right, good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us today for our webinar. Firstly, let me introduce myself. My name's Laura Edwards, and I'm RECCo's PR and Events Manager, and I'll be facilitating today's session. So the main purpose for today is to walk you through our forward work plan, outlining our priorities for the year ahead and inviting your feedback on the programmes, services and initiatives that shape the retail energy market. So today I'll start by running through the housekeeping. So please keep your cameras and microphones switched off during the speaker sessions. We do encourage you to ask questions as we go. We've got the Q&A function, but also feel free to raise your hand if you wanted to speak directly to the panel. We'll be launching MS Team polls as we go, and we really encourage you to participate because your thoughts and feedback are really important to us. And then just a polite reminder of, if you're going to ask any questions, just please keep them relevant and also avoid referencing other organisations. And then finally, as you may have seen already, the meeting's being recorded and it will be made available on the website. So we just ask to keep an eye on that, and we'll also email you the link to it. Thank you. Okay, so we've got another warm-up question, which I'll launch right now. And that is, how familiar are you with RECCo's role and services? Give you a few minutes. We're averaging on 4.1, so that's very familiar. Any further ones? And we've gone down to 3.7. So we've got some people who are new to the RECCo's role and services, and then some of you are very familiar with it. So that's a really good mix. Okay, so let me introduce our speakers today. So we've got Jon Dixon, who's there on camera. He's our Director of Development and Strategy. And then we've also got Suchitra Hammond, who's our Senior Strategy Manager. So between them, they'll present the key priorities and the direction of travel. And as you can see, we've got a busy agenda today. So as I said, we'll either be running polls or an open Q&A after each section. So moving forward, I'm pleased to hand over to Jon Dixon. Thank you.
Thanks, Laura. Good morning, all. Do you move us on to the next slide, please, Laura? So thanks for filling in that survey. It's useful to know how familiar you all are with the Retail Energy Code. It helps us kind of set the tone for some of the later bits of the presentation in terms of how much detail we might need to go into. I think a 3.7 and above is pretty good. We will try and avoid jargon for those of you who are not familiar with the Retail Energy Code, but if there are any questions on the details, then do ask us in the Q&A session or the chat. But we are going to keep this relatively high level today. We're quite limited in time. It's only an hour session. But what I would set out is that this is very much the beginning of the process towards our development of the forward work plan for 2026 through 2029. This is an annual process, and we're undertaking this in the same way we have for the past few years. There may be some changes to that process next year, which we'll come on to with the advent of the Code Manager license. But as things stand, it's as it has been running in previous years. What I would call out, though, is that whereas in the past in these sessions we've gone into great detail on the strategy as well as the forward work plan, last year we did separate out the two. So we do have an strategy which will hopefully stand the test of time for the next 5 years or so. We'll cover that very, very briefly, but there's a much more thorough webinar and details on that online. So I'll gloss over that fairly briefly, just set the context for what we're doing. What I also want to come on to is to set some of the establish the understanding for the context of some of our plan, because not all of it, in fact, much of it is not discretionary. As we'll touch upon, we are in the process of becoming the licensee, the Code Manager licensee for the Retail Energy Code, and that brings certain changes to the way we operate insofar as we'll become subject to strategic direction statements from Ofgem, which in turn are influenced by the government and by RECCo. We'll touch upon those a little bit later in the presentation. And we'll touch very briefly on what's driving an awful lot of those strategic direction statements. And I think it's fair to say that a large proportion of it has some linkages, one way or another, however indirectly, to the flexibility agenda and the government's aspirations to achieve 95% of clean power by 2030. We'll talk through how that strategic direction statement, albeit in a preliminary form, is feeding into our forward work plan. I think as per last year, we're relatively confident that most of the things that are in that SDS had been anticipated, and so there are already projects in train to deliver them, but there will always be that element of uncertainty and perhaps some surprises that come along the way, and we'll touch upon a couple of those as we go forward. That in part is why it's helpful to have these very early sessions with you. So if you think there is something we are missing from our forward work plan, or perhaps we haven't interpreted that strategic direction statement the way you have, and you think we're perhaps missing something, then please do shout up. We don't have a crystal ball on all these things, and we are here in large part to help you as market participants facilitate these discussions and to feed into our work plan, etc., and continue providing services to you. So this isn't a one-way conversation, albeit it's difficult having a webinar with so many people on board. But if at the end of this session there are any questions you would like to go to in more detail, or you would like to have a one-to-one discussion, or if there are several of you who would like to have a separate workshop on a particular topic, then we're more than happy to do that as well. So as I say, let's treat this as being the beginning of the conversation, leading to the publication of our forward work plan in the middle of January, and then subsequently that will inform our budget for 2026-27. I think that's all I want to cover in terms of the objectives of the day. Let's say, please feel free to use the Q&A button and the chat function to ask questions as we go along. If we move on from there, please, Laura. If you can move on to the next slide, please.
Yeah, so we've got another poll coming up.
Oh, sorry.
Just to see how familiar you are with the strategies. So launching that. So thinking about RECCo, on a scale of 1 to 5, how clear are you on our strategy and the priorities in our current forward work plan? It'll give us a rating between 1 to 5, that'd be great. It's going up to 2.9. Any more? Going to 2.7. Any more responses? So we rated 2.7 out of 5. So again, I think there is quite a spread between the stakeholders on our call. Thank you.
Thank you. Just check. So we'll touch briefly upon some of the elements of our strategy, but there's the link at the back of this presentation. We'll circulate the pack afterwards by email to those of you who've registered. So the links in there will take you to any of the documents we refer to, including the strategy document. So if you want to have a look at that in more detail, or indeed the webinar that we presented last year when we launched the strategy, the links will be on there. So I'll only cover this at relatively high level. The key thing I think we need to get across is the fact that our mission statement was established by Ofgem when RECCo was created, and that very much sets the parameters for what we do as an organisation. Fundamentally, our name says exactly what it says on the tin. We are the Retail Energy Code company, and therefore we can only do what the Retail Energy Code allows us to do. Essentially, everything that goes into that code has to be justified, essentially by a business case, and if it gets escalated to Ofgem, be determined against the REC objectives. One of those objectives is the fulfilment of that mission statement, and so there's kind of a circular approval of things that go into the code which prevent scope creep. So essentially our remit is very much determined by by the regulator, though I would say that it is the retail energy code in a broader sense. It's not the retail supply code. So though most of the underpinnings for this are set out in the gas and electricity supply licenses, other licensees are also obligated to be party to the RECC, and we'd see our role very much as being the kind of interface, if you like, between the regulated industry and the consumer. We're very much consumer centric code, and I think the as the market evolves, then we'd see our kind of footprint evolving with it, if you like. So the key thing of these sessions and our forward work plan is to make sure that we are anticipating the direction of travel of the market and evolving code, and what we do as a company that facilitates that code and provides services pursuant to that code, are following those market trends, etc., not simply delivering wherever Ofgem anticipated would be the shape of the market 5 years ago when we were created. So I think it's important that those regulatory underpinnings are understood and referenced. But beyond that, we've established some core aims that we want to achieve as a consumer-centric organisation. And first and foremost, we have to recognise that we are here to serve the industry. So we've set out amongst our 3 Ps. Primary point in that is perform, and by that we mean deliver service excellence, or at least continually strive to deliver service excellence in all we do. And that goes above and beyond the management of the RECC in the sense of providing change control, release management, etc., etc. This is all of the services covered by the retail energy code. So this would be inquiry services and switching and theft reduction strategy, etc., etc. So that will remain a fundamental part of everything we do in our forward work plan. We need to get the bread and butter activities right in order to give us the mandate, if you like, to do other things. Secondly, we have to recognise that we have that protect function, and again, this is in the broadest sense. In terms of business as usual, we can look at protection as meaning the systems and data that we have a role in managing, so making sure that security is always fully up to date, that systems are robust, that we're protecting consumers' data on there, etc., etc. But taking that further, we have a role in ensuring that the processes that we have a role in overseeing are assured and parties are compliant with it. So protecting the efficacy of the market arrangements, if you like. And I think in its very broadest sense, protecting the interests of consumers and market participants in all we do in the evolution of our services, and in responding to policies and trying to advise and react to what's coming out of Ofgem, government, etc., and trying to protect those interests as well. But we also recognise that we were set up to be a much more proactive code manager than perhaps the more reactive code administrators we've seen in the past, and I think that trend is very much part and parcel of the code reforms and the expectations of the code managers as licensees. So there will be that expectation that we also progress those policy initiatives and help deliver them, and the strategic direction statement that we'll come on to is part and parcel of that trend towards being more proactive in helping to deliver those more transformational changes than perhaps the more kind of incremental change that code bodies were responsible for since privatisation. I guess very gross generalisation, but those of you familiar with code governance will understand what I mean by that. So again, looping back to assessing the scope, just to reiterate and re-emphasise that there's essentially a 2-stage test to all of this. First and foremost is something new within scope of the retail energy code. If it's not, we simply can't do it. It's nothing to do with it. It's not within scope of what we do as an organisation. But we are, as well as being a governance body, also a service provider. So the second test is focused on whether or not a change should be delivered by the retail energy code company. And I guess that will become apparent when we see the contrast between something like the consumer consent service that is being delivered by ourselves, which we'll come on to later, versus tariff interoperability, whereas one covers both the the governance of consumer consent and the delivery of the consumer consent solution and the provision of that service on an ongoing basis, whereas tariff interoperability is much more about the governance of it, and we're leaving it to others, i.e. the parties themselves, to deliver the APIs in that case. So just because something is governed by the Retail Energy Code doesn't mean there's necessarily a service function associated with it from RECCo, but everything RECCo does as a service provider has to be provided for under the Retail Energy Code. So hopefully that kind of makes sense in how we make the distinction between the two functions we serve and how we weigh them up. I think that's all I was going to cover in terms of the background on strategy. Let's say it was a very brief run through to provide the context of what we do and the underpinnings of the existing regulatory arrangements. But as I say, they will change next year as part of code reform and the provision of code manager license, which we'll come on to now. If you can take me forward onto the next slide, please, Laura. Oh, another poll.
Okay, so we've got another poll before we go into code license. So, how would you rate your understanding of code reform? So 1, not familiar, and then 5 is very familiar. Oh, it's coming in quite quickly. So at the moment, averaging on a 3 out of 5, 5% on a 1, 35% on a 2. So knowledge, there's not a lot of understanding at the moment. So if we could go into detail on that, John, that would be great.
Yeah, happy to. I guess there is an awful lot to cover. It's a program that's been running for a few years now, and these slides are very brief. So again, if there are any questions you want to delve into in a bit more detail, please ask them either in the chat function or as Q&A, or more than happy to pick them up offline after this session. But essentially, to give a whistle-stop tour of this, you can take this back, I suppose, to the review of the market undertaken by the Competition and Markets Authority in 2016, where one of the areas of harm, of consumer harm, was identified as being the governance of the industry codes, which was perceived to be preventing or delaying beneficial changes from being progressed. And in a backdrop when the government wanted to pursue transformational changes to achieve environmental goals, one of the facilitating changes to do that was to improve the governance of the codes, so that when those changes came through, they could be expedited, etc. So the code reform project really started around about 2019, in terms of looking at what the issues around code governance were and why it was operating in a less than efficient way, and where the conflicts of interest might lie, etc. So the work has been going on for quite a while, but new powers to address this through license were really given to Ofgem as recently as 2023. The Energy Act created a new license category, which is essentially requiring the managers of the designated industry codes to be licensees and therefore more directly accountable to Ofgem. And I guess that's twofold. So that's to make sure that we are, say, more accountable for the day-to-day operation of the codes and our performance under those requirements. But I think more fundamentally about making sure that the industry codes arrangements were more responsive to policymakers' decisions more generally. So the Energy Act also created the rights for Ofgem to issue these strategic direction statements, which would become binding upon the code manager licensees to discharge. So this is really about fast tracking the evolution of policies from governmental decisions that can be enacted through statute, etc., into what are essentially the contracts, the industry codes, and therefore giving them meaningful effect. In the past, prior to the Energy Act 23, what would generally happen is government would set a policy direction, regulators would then look to back that off within licenses, that would all take several rounds of consultation and then periods of notice, etc., etc. And then only when something went into license with the relevant licensees, then go away and raise the necessary code modifications to change that at a contractual level. And then potentially even after that, there'd be changes to systems, etc. So you'd get a very sequential set of changes being made before any new policy area was given effect. What these reforms are essentially about is allowing some of that to be fast-tracked by circumventing the need necessarily to change the license, and also to make some of the central systems providers more directly responsible to Ofgem as well. So in addition to the code manager licensees, the Act also provided an ability for Ofgem to issue directions to the central systems providers. And again, this is all about trying to expedite those transformational changes that will be necessary to deliver not just 2030 targets, but 2050, etc. I think that's the genesis of all of this, if you like, and probably covers an awful lot of what we're going to come on to shortly in terms of the strategic direction statement and what underpins the vires for Ofgem and to do all of this. But it has to be said, and I touched upon earlier, those strategic direction statements are themselves derived from a strategic policy statement issued by DESNZ, and it also informed by NESO. So Ofgem is itself taking advice from those two bodies, turning them into some practicable directions, and then issuing to code bodies. So hopefully that makes sense in terms of where the various these things come from. The other thing we'll touch upon, again, very, very briefly, is some of the areas that will have direct impact on you as market participants, as parties. The private slide touched upon the fact that code manager licensees will now become responsible for the decisions on changes to codes, by and large. There could still be some that get escalated to Ofgem for decision, but by and large, the licensee will now be responsible for making those decisions, and therefore making sure that they're accountable for the rigor and everything else that you'd expect as a decision maker, replacing the more, I suppose, democratic role, if you like, that has been served in the past by panels made up of industry bodies. Again, if you go back to the CMA report, I think there was concern that those panels were often seen as stemming change because they were made up of industry parties with vested commercial interests, etc. And I think a very deliberate part of this was to move that decision-making role away from those panels to the licensee. However, those change panels will be replaced, so it's not about removing that stakeholder engagement entirely. So there will now be a stakeholder advisory forum that's advising the code managers on what that decision should be, etc. So that's quite a significant change for the industry in terms of the level of engagement and enfranchisement that code parties will have in those changes. Recognising that some of these changes impact up and down the supply chain and various different bits of what is still a relatively fragmented area of industry governance. There is a reference within the more recent Ofgem policies about beefing up the cross-code collaboration. So we already have a cross-code steering group which identifies impacts on other codes when that's been identified, but there's a real need to make sure that the planning around all of this and the coordination around the delivery of these cross-code changes is much more robust than it has been in the past. So we'd anticipate a more beefed up role for a cross-code steering group or something of a similar name. We will have to prioritise changes according to that strategic direction statement and essentially make sure that those that are seen as being strategically significant are being progressed as fast as possible and not having to take their place behind things that might be more mundane and not necessarily achieve those transformational changes, etc. I touched upon earlier that we as licensees will have to become more accountable for our delivery of the management of the code. So there's work ongoing around the performance metrics that should be applicable to code manager licensees, and I understand there'll be an Ofgem consultation on that fairly shortly. We've been working with Alexon and other code bodies over the past few months on what those metrics might look like and feeding that work into Ofgem to facilitate that consultation. And we'll also be looking into other areas as well, such as whether we could collaborate on the consultations on delivery plans against those strategic direction statements as well, so that you as interested stakeholders are not being inundated with consultations all at the same time, just because several code bodies have had to react to a strategic direction statement that's been published by Ofgem, etc. So lots going on. Not all of it will be directly relevant to stakeholders in terms of what you have to change or the impacts upon you, but say the code governance will change significantly initially for the RECCo and the BSE towards the end of 2026. We initially understood that the license would come into effect around summer 2026. We now understand that will be a little bit later. And then phase 2, we'll see a consolidation of some of the other codes and the managers of those codes becoming licensed, etc. And then a phase 3, wrapping up the final codes, which will include the SNEC, which has been left at last in part, not to interfere with the smart meter rollout, etc. So that's, I think, all I was going to cover directly on code reform. Hopefully that helps in terms of the broad brushstrokes of what it entails. But again, more than happy to answer any direct questions if there are any at that point.
Thank you, John. We've not had any questions via the Q&A, but please do submit any thoughts that you've got, any opinions, any questions. Does anybody want to raise their hand and ask John any questions? No. Okay, thank you. Okay, so we're moving now on to the forward work plan, which will be presented by Suchitra Hammond. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Laura. Thanks, John. Really helpful context in terms of what we're going to be doing in the forward work plan. So keep that in mind as I talk through what we're going to be doing in the forward work plan. A lot of what we were doing in the forward work plan was set out in our last year's plan, in fact. So Laura, if you could skip on to the next slide. Thank you. So last year we published our forward work plan, setting out our 3-year horizon as we do every year. And you'll see in this version, we had a lot of things that were spanning the 3-year period. So a lot of what you're going to hear in the forward work plan coming up is actually a continuation of what we'd already started last year. So it should be very familiar to you in terms of what we're doing, because a lot of those things are in train. But the important thing to keep in mind is that context that John has just set out, that the code manager license coming in, that code reform piece, will change the lens at which we look at some of this. So, for example, if you looked at our service excellence, we do, that top line of continuous improvement. We will continue to focus on our areas that we can improve our services. We will also look at that through the lens of code manager license. So one of the things that we will do there is look at standing up a design authority, for example, where we've got to look at the way that we manage change, how we prioritise that change, how we ensure that we're delivering against the strategic direction statement. So that function will enable us to be much more focused in the way that is going to be required by the licence. So there are some things like that that we will talk about in the forward work plan and explain the changes that we will make to ourselves in order to ensure that we not only deliver what we've already said we're going to deliver, but that we are looking at it through the lens of our obligations that are coming. And what I'm going to do is to talk you through in the next slide, what are the things that are continuing? Thank you, Laura. What's continuing, what you're already familiar with, and what to expect over the next year in terms of that continuity piece. So if we look at the top one, code manager evolution, our contracts with our current service providers are due to come to an end. And as a good code body manager, we're going to make sure that we are looking at what does that mean? How do we ensure that it remains fit for purpose? This is our opportunity to review that and ensure that we are providing value for money, making sure it's efficient, it's effective, and we're going to use that time to do that. And again, we're going to be looking at this very much through the lens of the license and what are the requirements and how do we make sure that that piece also is answered in the review that we undertake. Last year, we also talked about our digital services and we talked about how we could make improvements in that. We took the opportunity to do that review and understand where we could make improvements. So in the coming year, we hope to implement those changes. We hope to be able to bring changes to the portal so that you can do things like self-navigation better. You can have a more streamlined workflow or personalised dashboards, and there'll be a few more things along with that, but we'll be hoping to implement that this year. We also talked about our inquiry services because that's a big part of the service that we provide, and we want to again look at that through that lens of making sure that it's fit for the purpose, fit for the future, and we'll be looking at what we need to do in that space also. Two other big things that we talked about last year, and when we wrote them into the forward work plan, we were still waiting to see if we were going to be the designated body to take them forward, and during the course of the year that's exactly what happened. So both the consumer consent solution and the tariff interoperability standards were things that we talked about in terms of, if this comes to fruition, this is what we would do. So they came into place, and we've been working on those throughout the year, and there are sources available on our website if you want to find out more about them. With the consumer consent solution, we're at the stage where we are doing that detailed scoping, designing of what that solution might look like. The aim is to get to the development of the minimum marketable product by the end of 2027. Do correct me if I've got that wrong, John. And making sure that that user journey, that engagement with the consumer is a big part of our design and meeting that minimum marketable product. I think there's just been an impact assessment that's gone out on that. So do look at our website for that. I think it's available for you to see and to review and to comment on. So please do take a look at that. In terms of the tariff interoperability, that is going to be developing our REC schedule, the guidance of the performance indicators, testing that, and the aim is to be able to launch that minimal viable product. I believe there's also going to be a consultation on that, the REC schedule and the development of that. So please look out for that. I don't think that's come out yet. So things for you to be putting a note for your diary in the next couple of weeks to look out for that. Consultation, I think, is coming out from Ofgem. In terms of our other services, switching is a big part of what we do. And again, we're looking at the continuous improvement piece. We talked about that last year. A big part of that is the address management and data quality piece. There's been an issue on that for quite some time. I believe that is going to be developed into a change proposal so that we can focus on that. We've been working with DCC on that and making sure that we can get that into place. So a big piece of work to do there, looking at reporting enhancements, and of course we'll be mindful of changes that are happening to DCC themselves and their license renewal. So we'll be keeping an eye on that as it comes into play. The other thing I wanted to pick up on in terms of the work that is ongoing is our theft reduction strategy, and with that we've got 4 areas that we look at primarily. So our stay safe, that kind of awareness piece, and taking that up another level. We'll also be looking at how we reward those credible investigations that take place and looking at the incentive piece. The other thing we'll be doing is to test analytics to see if there are things that we could do with deterrence, so detection. What can we do with that? How can we better identify theft in the first place in terms of making that a deterrent? And of course, we'll be continuing with our pilot in terms of work with the City of London Police. So there's a big stream of work there. And again, it's continuing from last year. So all of these pieces of work are things that should be familiar with you. You should know what they are. And if you're not familiar with them, please do go and have a look at last year's forward work plan, because this will be a continuation, a development of what we set out. And they should be familiar for you in terms of what's coming next. So there is something in the Q&A. So I'm going to have a quick look at that and see if there's something there. When is the tariff interoperability consultation being published? June, I don't have the answer right now. As soon as we know, we'll publish that. But if I find out in the next week or so, be able to give you a date, but we don't currently have a date, is my understanding. Board work plan includes TPI. I'm going to come on to that. So good question. Hold that question. And provide a link to the, yes, there's a consumer consent solution hub, which is provided at the end of this pack. So we'll be able to give you that. One more question about inquiry services. How will you be working with other users to ensure that they have access to these essential services? Really good question. I think that's a really good piece in terms of we're seeing a change in the people who want to use the services, and we're going to be looking at making improvements in that space in terms of what might those future users be, how might they gain access, and we're going to be looking at that as a future piece, and it's a really good question to have asked. But we may come back to that also, Jake. So please do keep those questions coming. That's really useful. So a couple of things to come back to. One is in the inquiry services, and the other one is about TPIs. Laura, I think we're going into a poll, aren't we?
We are, thank you. Following on from what Suchitra has said, on a scale of 1 to 5, how strongly do you agree that the current carried over work streams remain the right priorities? Oh, so most popular score is a 4 at the moment. That's good. We're going into a 3.7 on average. Oh. Just wait for a few more responses. Great. And then the next question, we really, really want to hear from you. So do you think anything is missing? Please let us know. We really want to hear your opinion on this piece. Not had any responses. Oh, no, we've got some. So we've got TPI, COP, TPI code, DESNES route. Okay, so a few things for you to think about there, Suchitra.
Yes, TPI is top of the list.
It is, yeah.
Marvellous. Thank you. While that's coming in, if anything else pops up, we can look at that. So Jon's talked about the strategic direction statement, and even though this year's preliminary, we know that we're going to be licensed, we know that it's going to bite on us, and so what we've done is to start to look at what that means for us. It would be really helpful if we understood a bit about what you understand about it. So over to you, Laura.
Thank you. So have you read the statement is the big question. So we've got yes, no, or some of it. Got 50% at no, 40% some of it. It's big documents, I understand.
Yeah.
23% have read it. So
well done, you guys.
Yeah. And I'll hand over to you now, Suchitra.
Thanks, Laura. Thanks. It is quite a difficult document to read. It's long and it's difficult to follow through. And what we've done is a small blog on it, which is also in the resources, which you'll be able to pick up for those of you who would like a little summary about what it is. In terms of what it means for us, we've reviewed it, obviously. We've mapped across what the objectives are, what the actions for us might be. And we've looked at it against their 3-time horizon. So in the Act Now category, and that's the two nearest years to us. So over the course of the next 2 years, what does that mean for us in terms of impact on the RECC? And so we've looked at that, and I'm not going to cover off the ones that we already know, because some of these are already in train. For example, consumer consent, tariff interoperability, we know those are in train. We know that we've got to deliver plans. Those are things that are in train. The interesting thing here is about the new stuff, the stuff that's coming out. If you look at that top middle row in that space, we were looking at essentially the PSR, what's happening to the role of us in terms of looking after vulnerable consumers. And the SDS didn't really say that much about it. So we're in a position where we are in the listen and wait. So even though it says Act Now, there wasn't actually anything for us to action. Similarly, there was nothing in the protect non-domestic consumers. It was a kind of a wait and see position. So we were actually going to not have an action, but in the course of the last few weeks, you'll have seen that actually DESNZ have published their decision to go for direct regulation of TPIs, and we've had an initial conversation with DESNZ about that. We're going to have follow-up conversations with them and with Ofgem to understand exactly that piece, what is happening in the meantime, because there'll be a gap between Ofgem being identified as the regulator and then being designated that, because that requires an SI being put in place. So what happens in the meantime? What do they want us to do with our TPI code of practice in the meantime? So those are conversations that will start to happen, and we'll get a better understanding of that. So even though there wasn't something very specific when the SDS was published, it's actually now come out. So it's interesting to note that actually in the 2-year Act Now period, we can expect things to come in over that period. It doesn't mean to say that it'll all be identified when an SDS is published. They could come in during that period. So this is an active example of what that is. So we've very much got that on our radar, and we will be seeking to understand what that means and where that goes. The other thing with that is also the recent publication in the smart meter space for non-domestic customers. What happens to that consultation that's just been issued in terms of they're looking to put those rules within the RECCo. So we'll be monitoring that closely to understand what does that consultation mean for us, what that change might look like, when that might come in. So we've got 2 new pieces of work that weren't in the original SDS when it was published, but have come in subsequently that we will be focusing on. The other thing, 2 things I want to pick out on this slide is the data best practice obligation. We knew that this would be coming. It's going to be implemented, so we're taking that bull by the horns, if you like, and already looking at what does that mean, how do we implement that, and so that will be a piece of work we'll be delivering over the course of the next 12 months. Also, we've been working with DESNZ and understanding what they require to assist them with that rollout of low carbon technologies. A big focus for them has been ensuring that the safe isolator providers are working to a standard, that they are people who are recognised, and so they want an accreditation scheme, and we've been talking to them about that, and we will be looking to put that in place over the coming year. So those are the new things that we will be focusing on in the forward work plan. Next slide, please, Laura. There are a couple of things that I'm going to canter through in terms of the think and plan. We'll be having a look at things that come out in consultation. We'll be keeping a mindful eye and watching eye and brief on those things that are in that think and plan section. We've identified a few of those there. For example, we know the data sharing infrastructure is coming out from NISA, so we'll be mindful of what does that mean in supporting the data best practice obligations. What does that mean? That kind of stuff. We might be also looking at the electricity bill discount scheme. We know that the consultation said that it should come, the collection of that fund should come through network operators. Question mark whether that is actually going to be allocated to them, or in our previous role as a reconciliation operator for other schemes like the MSC, as to whether that might come our way. So we're just keeping a watchful eye on that as well. So there'll be a couple of things there that we'll be actively monitoring, and a couple of things there that we'll just have to wait and see what happens. Next slide, please. And the final part of the SDS has a much longer term plan, which is the listen and wait piece. And that's much more about future retail market, net zero, what's happening in that space. And we will be taking an active role in understanding what that might mean for the retail market, because it is about the retail market, it's about consumers. And so we think it's really important that we pick up on that and make sure that we're staying abreast of changes or consultations or what's happening in that space. I'm going to pause there because I think the next slide is a pause for more questions if there are any.
Yeah, we've got a poll as well. I'm just about to launch. So on a scale of 1 to 5, how well do you understand what the SDS means for the retail energy market? We've also going to open up the floor to a Q&A as well.
Yes, please. And please just come off camera or put your hand up. It's nice to speak to
we want to
people.
talk to you.
Please talk to me. Or John.
Okay, so we're averaging of 3 on this poll as well.
Okay.
We've got a couple of 4s as well. Yeah.
But hopefully that will give you a good picture in terms of the forward work plan is carrying forward a lot of the work that we said that we were going to do from last year. The impact of the SDS, we'll have to take that into account and build that into our forward work plan. Be really good to hear from you if you think there's anything that we've missed or that we should focus on differently. Happy to have more conversations about TPIs and inquiry services, and for those people to reach out to us directly if there's more interest in any of those areas. We can run more discussions on those. That'd be really useful. Okay, cool. I'm going to quickly canter through this just to give you a little bit of perspective in terms of the SDS didn't give us a critical path. It didn't say do X first and then do Y, and it didn't provide a lot of detail in some of those spaces. So we're hoping to work with Ofgem to better understand how that could be improved for the next SDS, and to involve us much earlier so that we can help them articulate that better. Okay, excellent.
So
anybody want to chat to us?
Not got any questions in the chat. However, I've just posted a link on the SDS statement and an interview with Suchitra, if anybody wants to have a read.
Thank you. In which case, I'll hand back to John.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to cover this very briefly in the interest of time, and given the nature of it. If you can move on to the next slide, please, Laura. So, underpinning an awful lot of what's in the SDS, you'll recognise that there are links to the flexibility agenda, as it's now been referred to, sometimes used interchangeably as demand side response, etc. The nomenclature needs to be sorted out because sometimes we use different terms to mean the same thing. But what we want to do highlight here on the next slide is just, as I say, how much of this is underpinning the change agenda, even in ways that it's not immediately apparent. An awful lot of this slide is really about the context for flexibility rather than particular to the RECC. But I just wanted to call out a few of the things that are in bold on here, and even some of those that aren't. So we know that we're going to have to change an awful lot of the market rules to enable a more flexible system. An awful lot of that is currently focused on upstream services and providing flexibility to NESO or to DSOs, etc. Doesn't really have an impact on the RECC. But if the government is to achieve its overarching ambitions about enabling most, if not all, consumers to benefit from flexibility and avoid some of the costs of new infrastructure and new generation, etc., there's going to need to be quite a large scale adoption of flexibility, much greater than is currently available through EVs and available with batteries, etc. We have a concern, it has to be said, that there's not a lot of clarity on how the new flexibility arrangements are going to impact upon the existing retail market. We know what's happening in terms of FMAR and market facilitation, etc. But an awful lot of the conversations seem to be, say, focusing on the system optimization, if you like, rather than what those actual consumer impacts are going to be. And even in documents referred to as being consumer-led flexibility, there's very few references to consumers and the consumer offers, other than we will all respond to price signals and we'll all have time of use tariffs, etc. not an awful lot on how that's actually going to happen. So in terms of the existing SDS, there are certain things that we can latch onto and say, we know we've got to do that in order to facilitate certain things. As part of the retail energy code, as Suchitra has touched upon, we are delivering the consumer consent platform, which will very much enable consumers to provide permissions to access their data and take those new offers, etc. And the tariff interoperability is essentially about facilitating that market as well. But we think we need to go beyond that. We haven't yet seen a lot of thinking on whether or not we need to change central switching systems, for instance, so that if suppliers are also aggregators and the customer switches supplier, how do they port those arrangements with them, etc. A lot of this, it has to be said, is being developed in a way that's parallel to the normal market, and so customers don't necessarily need to change supplier or change their terms and conditions in order to participate. But we certainly have a view that if this is going to be a mass market proposition, that probably does need to be integrated with existing retail functions. So what we want to do over the winter is do some more work on what that might look like and where we consider the gaps to be, and then early in 2026 have an open discussion, not just with those who are currently leading on aspects of this, such as Elexon and NESO and Ofgem, but those of you who might be interested in providing services into this nascent market, and trying to identify not just where those gaps are, but what we as a code body, as being responsible for those retail processes ought to be doing. And in some cases it will be nothing, because there's not going to be an impact, but we do think that in a lot of cases we need to be thinking ahead to what the eventual market model is going to look like. Are we going to need to reopen discussions on within day switching so that customers can make best use of surplus energy on a given day? Are we going to have multiple suppliers to a single MPAN, etc.? Those kind of discussions have been touched upon in the past, but haven't really been cemented into the current governance arrangements. And we'd like to facilitate more work around that. And as I say, even if it's just to try and identify how these things are going to work and point to where else they're taking place, we do think there's a gap there in some of these discussions. And that's not through a lack of ignorance as well. We have been raising these issues with Ofgem, DESNES, and with Mission Control directly, and there does seem to be a bit of an absence on those consumer focusing issues. So as I say, we'll do some work on that over the winter, and I think that will feed into our final forward work plan. Certainly the one that we published in January, but we're thinking that as an early step, we'll probably need to facilitate some discussions either on a one-to-one basis, to the extent this is about better understanding what business models might emerge, but also on a wider industry basis. Maybe have some large-scale workshops to help inform what, if anything, we need to be doing in this space. So if that's an area that you would be interested in participating in, the contact details will be provided in a moment in terms of how to get in touch with us. In the shorter term, as I say, there's things that we're already doing in this space that we can certainly build upon, but we're looking really to hear from you to find out what, if anything else, we could and should be doing to help facilitate this emerging market. I think that's all I was going to say on flexibility, to be honest, in the interest of time. But if there are any questions on that or anything else within the presentation, we can give over the remaining few minutes to discuss them.
Thank you, John. If anyone's got any questions about the whole presentation, please submit them via the chat or raise your hand. We've got one question that's just come in. So with consumption data so locked behind onerous consent rules, how can, for example, a solar installer or a heat pump installer show real world data to a user without having to jump through so many hoops?
Yeah, I tend to agree. That's exactly the sort of thing that consumer consent should be opening up. Although really that's about providing access to the consumer's specific data. I think for what you're suggesting, if I've understood the comments correctly, Jake, is it could be facilitated through aggregated or anonymized data. It shouldn't necessarily need those kind of permissions. But I think it's fair to say that data has been a bugbear of this industry in particular for a long time. And as I keep saying, we all know enough about GDPR to be worried about it, but not enough to be comfortable. But the government has identified this as an area of concern. There's been a lot of work recently on trying to open up smart data to facilitate not just the evolution of the energy industry, but other key industries as well, and try and adapt that dare to share ethos. I think in terms of some of the technical issues, Ofgem has just issued some work yesterday, I think it was, in terms of how the interoperability could be better facilitated through a common systems architecture, etc., and essentially nodding to the fact that we probably do need some quasi-design authority around all of this, even if it's not a formally constructed design authority, to make sure all of this is working in a much more robust fashion. Because I agree, it does all seem a little bit ad hoc at the moment and inconsistent, and that of itself is proving a barrier, I think, to innovation and to market growth. So it doesn't quite answer your question in terms of how do you resolve the issue in the here and now, but it is an issue that policymakers are aware of and are trying to tackle.
I've just popped a link to our Consumer Consent Hub into the chat. Jake has said, I wish this did solve the problems. However, as the project progresses, we will continually update the hub. So hopefully over time you will get an answer to the question. Okay, so moving on to next steps now, Jon. Okay,
so including this briefly, as I say, do use the opportunity to reach out to us and have one-to-one conversations if you would like, or if there is sufficient demand for a deep dive in a given topic, we can hold issue-specific or project-specific drop-in sessions or briefings. But essentially over the next couple of months, we'll be refining the forward work plan, incorporating feedback that we get through sessions like this and through those one-to-one discussions, etc. We'll be publishing the consultation on the forward work plan by the 15th of January, as per previous years. Very much would like your feedback on that, because that in turn will help drive not just whether or not the content makes the final version of it, but also whether or not the budget provisions that we're putting in there are adequate, etc. The budget itself will be determined once we've had the receipts to that forward work plan consultation. So we'll put out a subsequent document in February, and that is still subject to the existing appeal rules as per the RECCo as it stands. Now, as we understand it, Ofgem will be retaining that right of appeal once the code reform goes through, and potentially adopting that as a provision in all the other codes as well. So the process is as per previous years. As I say, still, well, I'd say 10 weeks or so before the final version goes out, but we'll be looking to lock it down this side of Christmas. So if you do want to reach out and speak to us, please do so. Well, before the end of November would be ideal. Any other questions?
We have got a question. Mark Gamble got his hand up. Should be unmuted.
Yeah, sorry.
So, hi, Mark. Thank you.
Hello there. I've not been able to put any chat or questions in, so I don't know if that's my side or your side. Apologies there. And it's just, and I don't know if I've missed it, and apologies if I have, and particularly talking about the future plan there. Jon, you and I have met a few times, and obviously there's a lot of times there's discussion with regards to RECCo spending a lot of time last year on the TPI code of practice. I noticed it was in column 3 a second ago, and forgive me if I missed that. Why we've not discussed it any further. But obviously DESNZ were also running in conjunction a code of practice as well. We know that the May one didn't actually fully go ahead on RECCo because Ofgem were deemed not to have the power to regulate TPIs. With that now changing, do you foresee that the RECCo code of practice is going to be dusted back off and utilised, or do you believe it might go down the DESNZ model, or do you think it will be Ofgem entirely starting a scrap again from you?
I think the honest answer is that's probably a question for Ofgem. We do intend to seek that clarity for them fairly shortly. As Suchitra touched upon, we're not expecting there to be anything imminently insofar as all of this has to be legislated for in order to formally give Ofgem those powers. So DESNZ have indicated the direction of travel, but they still have to make that happen legally. And then there'd no doubt be a delay before anything could come in to replace this. So we certainly think there's a need for something in the interim. Our voluntary code of practice will continue to be maintained, and in fact, on the back of the consultation that's just gone out from DESNZ on mandating that suppliers, non-domestic suppliers, can only offer a fixed term contract if there's a smart meter in place. That will have implications for TPIs as well, and we think there may be a role for the TPI code of practice in terms of coordinating how all of that can work together, because suppliers are essentially expected to back off those requirements on TPIs and ensure they're informing consumers of things when they're the interface, etc. So we do think there is a need to maintain that code of practice in the interim. Whether or not that's the solution in the longer term or not, we'll have to speak to Ofgem about. But we certainly think there's a role for it in the short to medium term.
Thanks, Jon.
Thank you, everybody, for joining today, and thank you for everybody's asked a question. Really appreciate it. So that concludes the questions and today's webinar. Again, thank you for joining us, and we do hope it's been helpful. We'll be launching the short poll. I've just popped it up there for your feedback, so please do let us know how you feel today went, so we can take that forward on future sessions. So in terms of immediate next steps, we'll be circulating the post-webinar documents, including the webinar recording, and that'll include the slides and a summary of the questions that have been asked. In the meantime, please do get in contact if you've got any other questions, or if you having your lunch break and think, oh, I wish I asked that, please just drop us a line. And I think that's everything today. So I will close the session and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Thank you.